minutes. So let us start the meeting now. Let us start the lecture. Uh, First of all, I would request everyone to mute themselves for the smooth happening of the session, and that's all. So then let us start the session. I'm Anaka. I'm a second year social work student. I'm doing social work in Dalit and Tribal Studies, and I am president of Progressive Students Forum. Progressive Students Forum is a student organization working inside in TISS Mumbai, and we as a student organization are actively organizing many academic lectures and other academic workshops, and we are also assisting students who are taking admission through our admission help cell, and we are also engaged in cultural organizing cultural activities in campus, and also we are like actively taking up the student issues that is happening inside the campus. Progressive Students Forum is working in campus for the past 12 years, and we are organizing this budget lecture. This is the 12th annual budget lecture that is happening, and I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor R. Ramakumar sir. So for students inside this, I don't think that we need a introduction for sir, because through foundation courses and all, sir is popular among us. And so for as an introduction, I would say sir is Ramakumar sir is a renowned development economist and currently a professor in School of Development Studies, and also he's the member of State Planning Board of Kerala government, and also Ramakumar sir have authored many articles and two books, which is one about demonetization and one other book about the economic liberalization and agriculture. So we are happy to have Sir Ramakumar sir as a speaker for our lecture, and I would like to welcome all the members who have joined the session, and especially we have shared the link to this meeting link to the new batch students who are in connection with us. So even though you are not inside campus, many of you have shown interest and joined the session. So special welcome to the new batch, and generally welcome all. So I would like to I'll be handing over the session to Ramakumar sir, and after that Lagan will be moderating the session. So sir will be speaking for some 30 to 45 minutes, and after that the session will be open to questions. You can ask questions either by unmuting or through the chat box. Over to Ramakumar sir. Welcome.
Thank you, Anaka. It's a great pleasure to be back here, let me say, because we started the annual lecture series on budgets in the year 2012, and even during the COVID period, we continue to give or organize these budget lectures, and I'm happy to note that even if it is online, it is continuing for the 12th year this time also. So I have great pleasure in joining this lecture this year as well. Now, as Anaka said, I shall speak for about 45 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. I shall not be using any slides. I am going to speak based on major themes that I sort of identify from the budget. But before I get into the budget per se, it is important to understand the context in which this budget was presented, and that context is very important to understand if we have to understand the budget in its entirety. Now, as you all are aware, there was an interim budget which was presented in the month of February of 2024, just prior to the parliament elections. But that interim budget had some numbers in it, some of which are updated in the full budget presented the last week, largely they are the same except in the case of one inflow of revenue that has come into the government, which is in the form of the dividends of the RBI. But otherwise, these two are largely the same. But the larger issue here is the confidence with which the government went to face the elections in April, May, and June of 2024, and the major setbacks that it received in the elections. That is the context to this budget. Now that makes a huge difference to how we understand this budget, how we study and analyze this budget, and that's very important. Because every budget is not a purely technical economic document. The budget is a very important political animal also. So if you understand budgets through the lens of politics and political economy, then we can also not see the budgets through the lens of what happened through the elections in April, May, June 2024 also. What happened during elections in 2024? The BJP, which was the ruling party, went into the elections with enormous confidence, enormous hubris, so to say, and claimed in the beginning that they are going to go 400 par. Now they were extremely confident they are going to win 400 seats or more. But as the elections went by, they sort of pulled down that target, and finally they BJP ended up at 239 seats in the elections, which is far short of the majority mark of 272. So essentially we have a coalition government in power, and this government is dependent in a major way. They are dependent on many parties, but they are dependent primarily on two parties, the Janata Dal United and the Telugu Desam Party. And that is one important point to begin from. This is also important in a different sense, because I spoke about the confidence with which the BJP went to face the election, and the confidence was sort of based on, or it was sort of sought to be propagated among the electorate by claiming that Indian economy has been significantly transformed in the last 10 years of the Narendra Modi Prime Ministership, and that even after COVID, Indian economy is progressing rapidly. It is the fastest growing economy in the world. It has the fastest growing employment among developing countries. These were very important claims made in the onset of the elections, which in some sense set the tone for the debates surrounding the economy in the election itself. What we see in the elections is that unlike in earlier elections, as in 2014 or 2019, economic issues managed to predominate the discourse around election campaigns. Now in 2014, which happened soon after the Muzaffarnagar riots of 2013, there was a certain communal agenda that was in place. In 2019, there was a similar communal agenda, but along with that, certain ultra-nationalist slogans and sentiments also were at play. Now, these two elections, 2014 and 2019, particularly 2019, because that's when the government got re-elected, and also elections to different state governments over the last 10 years, what you see is, even though the economy was doing very badly, even though all economic indicators were showing deterioration in one form or the other, even though there were disastrous policies like demonetization, even though there were policies that affected the small-scale sector and the informal sector significantly, like the ill-planned GST reform, even though the response to the pandemic in 2020 and 2021 ended up exacerbating the sufferings of people, all these instances of economic distress were sought to be overcome by the government through either communal slogans or ultra-nationalist arguments in the discourse. So this provided the government with a very important shield in all these elections that happened in the last 8 to 9 years, whereby poor economic performance was sought to be covered up, masked by these communal slogans and arguments related to either religious divisions in the society, or external aggression from our neighbors, or some kind of imagined enemies that we have inside and outside. All these typical of right-wing populists, these were cases in India as well. So economic indicators never really decided an election in India in the last 8 or 9 years. The BJP actually thought that that would be the case in 2024 as well. That was the basis of their confidence. So they had this inauguration of the Ram temple. They had different other measures, policy measures, and also cultural initiatives which set the stage for a communal discourse in 2024 as well. But what all election surveys, pre-poll and post-poll surveys tell us is that economic issues were predominant in deciding voter preferences. That became a real problem for the BJP, and that largely explains the huge setback that they received in the elections. This was long in coming, so to say, but this time the communal slogans were unable to cover up for the blunders in the economy. That is a key point to note here. So you have a problem of slow growth, you have a problem of agrarian distress, you have the context of farmers' agitations across the country, you have the problem of livelihood issues dominating, and all surveys show that among the livelihood issues, poor growth of employment and high levels of inflation dominated the voter decisions. It's dominantly influenced the voters' decisions, and these things ended up deciding how voters decided in the parliament elections that we just saw. So this, for example, I spoke about the agrarian districts. In many constituencies in the northern parts of India, the candidates of the BJP were not even allowed to enter certain constituencies by disenchanted farmers who were protesting. All that has decided the election verdict in one way or the other. And the BJP had won close to 201 seats in predominantly rural constituencies of India. Okay, among predominantly rural constituencies of India, BJP had won 201 seats in 2019, but this time they won only 126 seats, according to an analysis by the Reuters. So 201 to 126 is a huge fall of about close to 75 seats in rural areas. That essentially turned the picture against the BJP, and that is what we see in the final numbers. So there was enormous anger, there was enormous disenchantment against the government, and that has decided the verdict in one form or the other, and that has led to a new government, which is not anymore dominated by the BJP, but it is essentially a new government, which is an alliance government. And that is a huge difference between 400 Par and what we have now. Now, the expectation then, generally, is that the government would make course corrections. The government would understand or accept the mistakes that were committed, and it would actually correct the course in some form or the other. So everybody who observed budgets expected that there would be some new announcement coming, or some major initiative coming, or some major policy turn coming, and so on. But as we all know, the finance minister remains the same, the bureaucracy remains the same. There has been no shaking up of the bureaucracy either, and what we have at the end of it is something which is largely similar from what we had last year, or even in the interim. There was also the question of demands of different allies. It was Andhra Pradesh and Bihar were asking for special packages from the central government, and there was some expectation that the government may allow something for them also, even if not in the form of a package, it would be in the form of some grants or some special allowances, which will take care of their concerns and complaints. So these were the expectations that people had. There would be some course correction, and there would be some allowances given to some of these states. Now, happen, something extraordinary must concurrently happen in the accounts of the government, right? And for that, it requires that your tax revenues grow, your non-tax revenues grow, or something else grows outside the tax revenue, which is in the form of disinvestments or something else that provides some windfall gains to the government. In the absence of all these, you typically should expect a largely similar budget as last year. Now, this is the context that I wanted to put forward. The political change that happened, the new government in power, and the new expectations that were on the table. Now, these are matters of perception, but let us get into the economic situation that actually exists or survives in the economy today. To begin with, it's important to understand that for the last 10 years, and that does not necessarily include COVID, even prior to COVID, even if you consider the period till 2019-20, which is the year prior to COVID, you will see that almost every economic indicator in India was showing a deterioration. That's exactly what the government managed to cover up over a period of time. If you remember the 2019 parliament elections, most predictions from psephologists prior to the elections did not paint a picture where the BJP was likely to win. But then the Pulwama incident happened, and that significantly influenced the decisions of voters, and the BJP came back to power. Essentially what it means is that economic indicators were pregnant, economic issues were pregnant in the discourse even at that point of time, but they were sort of overshadowed by the discourses around Pulwama and ultranationalism and so on. So this was important. So what I'm trying to say is economic indicators were deteriorating even prior to COVID, and this essentially shows up as a fall of investment rate, a fall of savings rate, a fall of exports to GDP ratio, a fall of bank credit growth, a fall of industrial production, a fall of services growth. Every indicator that you saw in the economy that you sort of consider as fundamental to economic growth were actually deteriorating even prior to COVID. And these indicators of the economy that were deteriorating over the last decade, some people may say COVID exacerbated it. But I would say even prior to COVID, there were two phenomena which had already exacerbated the situation. One was the demonetization of 2016 November, and then there was this ill-planned GST reform of 2017. These two were two important shocks to an already ailing economy in 2016 and 2017. So that had made a bad situation worse already. By 2019-20, your economy was growing in some quarters by only just 3%. 3% per annum. That was the state prior to COVID, right? So this bad economy, economy in a bad state becoming an economy in a worse state met COVID in 2020. Now, 2 years of COVID with very little or very weak counter-cyclical responses from the government on the fiscal sphere, and a very poor response of the government in ensuring that enterprises remained alive, were not shut down, jobs were not lost, and so on. This failure of the government essentially meant that the economy moved from an already bad situation to a worse situation with demonetization and GST reform, and then from worse, where do you go? It became even more worse by 2021 and 2022. Now, so you have an already slowing down economy, and the conditions are exacerbated by demonetization, GST reform, COVID pandemic, and so on. And in all, if you put together all these issues over the last 10 to 12 years, the feature of the economy that stands out is that there is a destruction of production in the economy. destruction of production activities in the economy. That is very important to underline as a context. You have not just a slow growth of industry, manufacturing, and so on, as well as services on the other. You particularly have a collapse of the economy in those sectors which are significantly labor intensive. For example, the MSME sector, which is including in some form small production groups in the informal sector. Those were the areas which saw extraordinary forms of destruction. Millions of enterprises were shut down. As many jobs were lost. And this essentially created a huge decline of the productive capacities in the economy. Now, this meant that as destruction of production happened, destruction of employment also followed, because these were all labor-intensive sectors. So essentially, you have a fall of growth, due to a fall of production, which leads to a collapse of employment. You may remember in 2017-18, the periodic labor force survey of the NSSO showed an unemployment rate of 6.1% in the economy, up from 2.1% in 2011-12. And this 6.1% was the highest unemployment rate India had recorded in the previous 45 years. Even today, the unemployment rate is 3.2%, which is still higher than the unemployment rate recorded in 2011-12. Now, so this is the first issue here. And this collapse of production, employment, and so on led to a huge fall of aggregate demand in the economy. This fall of aggregate demand in the economy is evidenced by the fact that there are huge unutilized capacities in the manufacturing sector of the economy. Earlier, a few years back or a decade back, your manufacturing sector was producing up to 83 or 85% of its capacity. If you could produce 100 kg, you were producing 85 kg. That means you had the confidence that you could sell that 85 kg if you produce it. But now that has come down to about 73 to 75% only. In other words, companies are not producing up to the levels of their capacities that they used to a decade back. It is a clear sign of a fall of aggregate demand in the economy, because companies are not confident that they can sell if they produce. That's because there has been collapse of employment, collapse of incomes, collapse of livelihoods, etc., and the capacity to purchase in the economy has fallen. Now, this is also the reason why companies are not investing in the economy. No capitalist is investing in the economy. This is because if you invest in new capacities, only if your older capacities, earlier capacities are in some form exhausted, but you're actually pulling back on your earlier capacities itself. So why would you invest in anything new? Investment rate was falling. If between 2011-12 and now, investment rate fell from about 38-39% to about 28-29%, which meant that there is an accumulated loss of investment in the economy. If I assume that the investment rate remained at 39%, India could have, in the last 10 years, additionally invested rupees 97 lakh crore in the economy. But that was not invested. Okay, somebody may say 39% is a very high investment rate. Okay, fine. Let's keep it. If the investment rate had remained at 36% over the last 10 to 12 years, we could still have invested close to rupees 47 lakh crore in the economy. Again, that is investment foregone because investment rate fell. This is another indicator that aggregate demand in the economy is shrinking. Then you have bank credit. People will come to the banks and take loans for new investment only if there is demand in the economy. Third indicator here. But bank credit growth has been very sluggish. If you remember, Arundhati Bhattacharya, the chairperson of the SBI, a few years back was lamenting in a public function that I'm sitting on rupees 2 lakh crore to 3 lakh crore, but nobody is coming to me to take loans from me. The reason is that there was no demand in the economy. Right? So this problem of aggregate demand is why banks are not unable to give adequate amounts of credits, companies are not investing in the economy, and unutilized capacities are growing. Nirmala Sitharaman, 2 years back, went to a meeting of the CII, Confederation of Indian Industry, and was scolding the industrialists, asking, I have done so much for you. I have cut the corporate tax for you. I have done this, I have done that. Why are you people not investing in the economy? No industrialist had the courage or the backbone to get up and say, Madam, there is no demand in the economy. How can we invest? So this is the problem of destruction of production, destruction of employment, and shrinkage of aggregate demand. Typically, governments end up spending more when there is a problem like this. They end up spending more, put money into the pockets of people, so to say, and try to enhance or expand consumption in the economy, and thereby pump prime the economy into a higher level of aggregate demand, and try to get the economy out of the pits that it is falling into. Now, this also did not happen except during the 2 years of COVID that you had, where spending went up, but immediately after that, spending came down drastically, and the government is today just into the third year of COVID, the government was talking about fiscal consolidation. In other words, it was saying that we will bring back the fiscal deficit to 3 or 3.5% by 25-26, while other economies of the world were continuing with their fiscal stimuli. So India did not spend in the economy also over the last few years in order to counter the fall of aggregate demand. So the fall of aggregate demand continued to be a problem afflicting the economy. There is also an overall loss of confidence in the economy. If you look at net FDI flows into the country, they are falling today. I'm not a big fan of FDI, but as a matter of fact, the fall of net FDI into the economy, flowing into the economy, essentially is a sign of poor confidence in the economy, in the health of the economy on the part of international investors. So that is another problem that we have. You have problems in agriculture and the agrarian distress which continue. The government had promised that they will double the incomes of farmers, but now they are not even talking about that promise that they gave to the farmers, because even in real terms, the incomes from cultivation have been falling in this country. Then they had promised MSP, which would, in 2011, Mr. Narendra Modi was the chairman of a working group, which gave, he was the Gujarat chief minister then, which gave a report to the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh at that point of time, asking for MSP to be legal in the economy. But once he became Prime Minister, he forgot his own report submitted in 2011. Today, he does not even mention the legality of MSP, even though that remains to be a live issue for farmers' movements in the country, and that is one of the most important demands of the farmers' movement in the country. He has also refused to raise MSPs as Professor M.S. Swaminathan had recommended in the National Commission for Farmers report. So these are issues there. Now come to COVID. The government is saying that post-COVID our recovery has been very fast. Is it true? Let us see the economic survey. The economic survey considers 2019-20 as a benchmark. So if your GDP was 100 in 2019-20, today, 5 years later, you are at 120. Just a 20% rise. 20% rise over 5 years essentially means an annual growth rate of 4% per year. Yes, but there were 2 years of COVID, which was very bad. But essentially, you have just about 4% growth per year over the last 5 years. And for an economy of our size, for an economy with our demographic dividend, for an economy with such a large job-seeking youth, such high levels of unemployment, just about 4% growth rate per year can actually be disastrous. No economy of this size and this kind of challenges can actually survive at 4% growth per year over a period of 5 years. That's where the Indian economy is today. So that is yet another challenge that we have. Now, finally, even though there were huge losses of employment, the government was very confident. It was like the India Shining campaign of 2004. The government kept on saying that unemployment is falling, employment is expanding, and so on. While its own data, the periodic labor force survey was showing, whatever increase in labor force participation or fall of unemployment that happened in the last 5 or 6 years was only because of one predominant factor. What is that one predominant factor? There was only one area where employment actually grew in the last 5 years or 6 years, and that is the reason why the government is able to claim a fall of unemployment rate. And what is that? A rise in the share of self-employed women in rural areas employed in agriculture. I will say that again. The rise in the share of self-employed women in rural areas employed in agriculture. That's it. So essentially, what we are seeing is, due to COVID, people, from demonetization time and then after COVID, when large number of people lost jobs in urban and semi-urban areas and returned to the villages, they all began to crowd agriculture. Whatever little piece of land they had of their family in the villages and so on, either of their own or they would sometimes lease in, they would start cultivating it for their own limited food requirements. As a result, you see a huge expansion of people entering agriculture. Usually you see people exiting agriculture. Here you're seeing people entering agriculture from industry, from services, people are entering agriculture. And among them, women, and all of them self-employed, which essentially means all of the expansion of employment is unpaid in nature. So this expansion of unpaid employment is being celebrated as a huge achievement of the government over the last 5 years. That's what you saw in the run-up to the elections. But that balloon burst as soon as it was very clearly pointed out by many. I'm sorry, my screen froze. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes. I hope you're able to see and hear me now. I'll continue. Sorry. So it is this phenomenon in the labor market, that the rise of the share of self-employed women in agriculture in rural areas, that was being tom-tommed as a fall of unemployment rate in the economy. So this did not wash. Unemployment was something that people were experiencing firsthand in villages and cities, and this became a very important issue despite spirited denials and tall claims by the government. The reality was directly felt by people, and that is why unemployment and also inflation became important livelihood issues in these elections, and the BJP lost the number of seats the way it did at the end of it. Coming to the budget of 2024-25, if you compare the interim budget of 24-25 in February and the full budget for 24-25 in July, what you actually see is, you don't see that confidence anymore. There is an acceptance that the economy is not doing well. Nirmala Sitharaman does not say it in those many words. She's a proud woman, as you can see in her gestures, in her tone, in her body language, and so on. It's very difficult for her to accept her own mistake. But what you see in the in reading between the lines is there is an acceptance today that the economy is doing badly and unemployment is the elephant in the room with respect to the problems in the economy. That's why you see a lot of announcements related to skill development, internship, etc. I shall come to that towards the end. But let me get to the point. Even if you see the budget documents, you will see GDP at nominal prices were growing at 14.2% in 22-23, but in 23-24, the growth rate falls from 14.2% to 9.6%. So in the last year, for which we have clear data, you have a fall of growth rate from 14% to 9.6%. It's very clear. The same issue that we have been discussing till now is out there. That document, this year's budget document also shows that our exports have been falling. Even our imports have been falling. Right? And very clearly, if you look at the economic survey and if you read in between the budget documents, you will see that there are 2 or 3 very important issues that the finance minister must have dealt with. A logical reading of the data and the economic survey would lead any finance minister to A, focus on growth, production and jobs. 1, economic growth, reviving production and generating jobs. Number 1. Number 2, our social protection system is very small, it's narrowly built, and it has to be expanded. And number 3, there is very little investment in human capital that we are making today, and that needs to expand. So, growth, production, and jobs, social protection, and investment in human capital. I would have expected the finance minister to focus on these 3 areas in the budget she actually presented, which essentially means that there has to be an expansionary activity in the budget. The budget has to be expansionary. The budget has to increase expenditures in the economy. The budget has to expand investments in the economy. And that has to be a primary goal of the government. Now, what is happening in the budget? Let's look at some basic budget maths to begin with. The fiscal deficit of the economy is of the central government, I'm sorry, not of the economy, because it will include the states, of the central government, will fall from 5.6% to 4.9% between 23-24 and 24-25. These are all percentages of GDP. So fiscal deficit will fall from 5.6% of the GDP to 4.9% of the GDP, which is a fall by 0.7% of the GDP. Right? Now, in other words, you're going to borrow less. You're going to that much of inflow into the revenues of the government is going to fall. It's all right if your tax or non-tax revenues will grow and compensate for this fall of borrowing. Does it? If you look at tax revenue, it is going to rise from 11.7% of the GDP to 11.8% of the GDP. 0.1% of the GDP is going to be the rise in tax revenues, gross tax revenue of the government of India. That's all. Every month you see GST production is growing by this much and so on. You don't see that in these numbers. As a share of the GDP, gross tax revenue will rise only from 11.7% to 11.8%, 0.1%. Non-tax revenues similarly are going to rise from 1.4% of the GDP to 1.7% of the GDP, which is a rise by 0.3% of the GDP, which in my view is very unlikely because A, it is expecting a flow of dividends from the RBI at the same rate as it happened this year, which I'm not sure will happen next year also. Second is that they are projecting high levels of inflows of revenues from disinvestment of public sector units, which is also unlikely to happen given the poor level of demand and business spirit in the economy, which means that your non-tax revenues are unlikely to grow by this much. But nevertheless, if I just go by the budget numbers, your gross tax revenue will grow by 0.1% of the GDP, and your non-tax revenues will grow by 0.3% of the GDP. But your fiscal deficit will fall by 0.7% of the GDP. In other words, your budget will shrink by close to 0.3% of the GDP. There is no other way. The budget, the total expenditure has to shrink. The total expenditure has to be cut to the extent of 0.3% of the GDP if revenues and expenditures have to match, as they must do in any budget. So what is the 0.3% of the GDP expenditure fall that we are talking about in rupee terms? It comes to close to rupees 88,000 crore rupees. So rupees 88,000 crore rupees is likely to be the cut of expenditure in 24-25 compared to 2023-24. That is the first takeaway from this budget. It is a contractionary budget. At a time when your major objective must be to rejuvenate growth, restart production, and generate jobs, along with your other responsibilities like social protection, investment in human capital, etc., you must find ways to either borrow more or raise your tax revenues at a much faster rate, so that you are able to push more money into the economy from the public kitty. That is not happening. Instead, it is actually expenditures are going to fall by rupees 88,000 crore in 24-25 as compared to 23-24. That is why I call it, to begin with, a contractionary budget. This is not for the first time, except for the 2 COVID years. I have been presenting these budget talks from 2012 onwards in this platform, and what I see every year, you see from that time onwards, you will see that all my budget talks, some of them are on YouTube, you'll see I have been mentioning this point, that consistently over the last few years of the UPA 2 government and into the NDA government, you have been consistently seeing contractionary budgets. That is why your total expenditure to GDP ratio over the last 10 years has been regularly falling. Regularly falling. That is why I said earlier that instead of counter-cyclical fiscal policy, spending more in the economy when growth is sluggish, our economy our government has actually been spending less and less in the economy as a share of the GDP. You have actually a pro-cyclical fiscal policy, which is very perverse in its outcome. This is the most important takeaway that you get as you look at the budget maths. Now, why does the expenditure fall like this? As I said, the government is refusing to borrow more, number one. The government is refusing to borrow more because it thinks that fiscal deficit will rise if you borrow more. What is the problem if fiscal deficit rises? The government perceives, neoliberal economists perceive, that any rise in fiscal deficit will actually scare away foreign investors from coming and investing in our economy. What is this problem that foreign investors will have? Foreign investors are coming for profits. They are hot money operators sometimes. They look for small either interest rate or profit arbitrages in every country, and they move money across borders at a very rapid pace. And one of the things that they look for in an economy, one of the things that they look for before coming into an economy is whether you have a secure economy in place or not. Is this economy safe to go into? And it is generally perceived, to check whether it is safe to go into an economy or not, these rating agencies and so on, they look at fiscal deficit, and if fiscal deficit is high, they will tell their investors that it is not a safe economy to go into, and foreign money will come less and less into your economy. This is why all neoliberal economies are fundamentally fiscally austere in nature. scared by the fact that your foreign capital inflow might fall if you raise your fiscal deficits. And this is the reason why the government is telling, except for the 2 years of COVID, they have been telling the Indian people that they will fiscally consolidate. They will bring down fiscal deficit. They will bring down the debt to GDP ratio, and so on and so forth. Now, borrowings are going to come down. That's why expenditures are not rising. But there is another way in which expenditures can rise. You can actually raise tax collections in the economy. But what is happening to your tax to GDP ratio over the years? If you look at your tax to GDP ratio over the years, let me look at two numbers. 2017-18, your tax to GDP ratio was 11.2%. And today in 24-25, your tax to GDP ratio is 11.8%. 11.2%, 11.8% over about 7 to 8 years. There is absolutely no increase. It is stagnant, so to say. If you go to other developed countries, you will see tax to GDP ratios of 16%, 17%, etc. We have been stuck between 10 and 11% for a very prolonged period of time in the last 2 or 3 decades. And that is because you are refusing to tax your rich in the economy. Your number of billionaires is growing. Your inequality is skyrocketing. But you are not ready to tax your rich. Instead, what the NDA government did in 2019 was that it actually, to help the corporate sector, it cut corporate taxes in an unprecedented way from 30% to 22%. When you cut taxes like that from 30% to 22%, what happened to revenue inflows was that every year the government had to forego close to 1.5 lakh crore rupees to 2 lakh crore rupees that would have come as corporate taxes into the public exchequer. That's the money that was lost. And that continues. So when your job is to collect more taxes in the economy, you gave a bonanza to the corporate sector in the form of a corporate tax cut. And what did the corporate sector do? Did they respond by increasing investment in the economy? No. They repaid their old debts. They fattened their kitties. They cleaned up their balance sheets and so on. And their profit rates began to rise even during the COVID period. That is the vulgarity of rise of corporate profits that you saw during COVID, when close to 80% of the economy was facing an absolute loss of incomes. This is one of the important reasons why your tax to GDP ratio is not growing. You're also not collecting new taxes. For example, you would have seen the new paper by Thomas Piketty and his co-authors. I'm very happy to note that one of the co-authors, Anmol Somanchi, is actually an old student of TISS in development studies. He studied for the master's program there. He's doing his PhD in Paris School of Economics now. If you look at that work, you will see that the top 1% of the Indian economy, top 1% of the Indian population, they actually have a combined wealth of rupees 500 lakh crore rupees. If you actually put a 2% wealth tax on this wealth of the top 1%, which is close to rupees 500 lakh crore, and also once in a lifetime inheritance tax of about 25%, you can actually collect on the net close to about 12 lakh crore rupees every year additionally as tax income. But we have no inheritance tax. South Korea has an inheritance tax of 50%. Japan has an inheritance tax of 55%. United States and United Kingdom have inheritance taxes close to 40%. We have 0%. Baap Kamal, it's the Indian slogan. Whatever your father earns, you inherit it for free. You don't pay a penny to the government as taxes. While the principle in the advanced capitalist world is that what your father earned, right over it except when you are agreeable to pay an inheritance tax on it to the government. Only then it becomes your money. But we don't have it. So if you have 2% wealth tax and a 25% inheritance tax on just the top 1% of the population in this country, you can collect close to rupees 12 lakh crores every year. And that can take care of you can triple the Narega budget every year. You can have an urban employment guarantee program. You can pay every elderly a pension of 3,000 rupees. You can spend 6% of your GDP in education. You can spend 3% of your GDP on health. All these things you can do with just this extra tax measure. But what we see is actually a situation whereby somebody is saying if we collect tax from the 1%, they will start fleeing from the economy. Nobody will flee. Is anybody fleeing from other advanced capitalist countries? They're not. Right? So this this money could be collected from the population where inequality is growing in a vulgar form. One industrialist is conducting a marriage at rupees 5,000 crore approximately, it seems. We allow these things to happen. This is his money, individual freedom, no problem. But when the point here is, when his children inherit this money, they inherit it for free. You don't. It doesn't happen in other advanced capitalist economies of the world. So, this is why your expenditure is falling. You are unable to raise taxes. You are hesitant to borrow more and raise your fiscal deficit. And as a result, you have chosen the only alternative that is available, which is to cut expenditure. And as I just mentioned, you are going to cut expenditure to the tune of rupees 88,000 crores. If you see the budget maths, that's the total cut that is likely to be the case. Now, this cut in expenditures has already begun in some sense. If I compare 2022-23 and 2023-24, which is the last year, okay, you will see that the government did exactly the same thing. It had promised something in the budget, but it spent far less than what it showed that it would spend in the budget. That's the difference between budgetary estimate and revised estimate, right? So if you see how expenditures fell in the last year, I'll just take 2023-24. What was the budget estimate? That is what was announced in the budget, and what was the revised estimate, what was actually spent at the end of the year. You will see that the expenditure on agriculture was less by rupees 3,700 crore last year. Expenditure on education was less by rupees 7,500 crore. Education on health was less by rupees 9,700 crore. Education on social welfare was less by rupees 8,400 crore. Education on have I been saying education? I'm sorry. Allocation for agriculture was less by rupees 3,700 crore. Allocation for education has been fell by about rupees 7,500 crore. Allocation for health fell by rupees 9,700 crore. Allocation for social welfare fell by rupees 8,400 crore. Allocation for all central sector schemes fell by rupees 15,400 crore. Allocation for PM Poshan fell by about 2,680 crore in the last year compared to the previous year. And then, if you see the PM Uchatar Shiksha Protsahan scheme, or PMUSP, right, which is a scheme in higher education, and I think because it is a students' forum here, you might be interested in some of the numbers I'm going to give now. The PM Uchatar Shiksha Protsahan scheme, the budget estimate was rupees 1,500 crore. Actual spending was only 1,000 crores. The total student financial aid in higher education, the budgeted amount was rupees 1,954 crore. The actual spending was only 1,300 crore. RUSA, Rashtriya Uchatar Shiksha Abhiyan, higher education scheme. That, if if you look at last year, the difference between the budgeted expenditure and the revised expenditure is rupees 1,000 crore. If you take other schemes, for example, the umbrella scheme for scheduled castes, that was cut by rupees 2,600 crore. And where was this umbrella scheme? Means you have a lot of small schemes inside it. And when you say umbrella scheme for SCs cut by rupees 2,600 crore, where were the major cuts inside this? It was in the post-metric scholarship for scheduled caste students, and also in what is called as the PM Ajay, right? Anusuchit Jati Abhivruddhi Yojana, that is PM Ajay, right? These two saw the biggest cuts within that. Then there is a small increase in what is called as the Shreyas scheme for SC students, but there is a small cut at the same time for Shreshta scheme for SC students. One is for best students in SC category. The other is for residential schemes in SC category. One slightly rose, but the other slightly fell. Cancelled some. Skill India program, the most sort of celebrated flagship scheme of the government. The spending was cut by rupees 4,000 crore between the budget estimate and the revised estimate. Then there is something called mechanizing sort of sewage and sanitary work, which is contributing to the elimination of manual scavenging. That is called the Namaste scheme. What a horrible name to give for that. The Namaste scheme, because this essentially comes from the idea that this is a manual scavenging is a spiritual activity and so on, which is the political position of the Prime Minister, which is abhorring in some sense. But if you look at the expenditure on this scheme, you will see the commitment to the cause. 90 crore rupees was kept aside, but only 30 crore rupees was spent, even for a small scheme like this, but which is very important to us. So this is what has already happened in the economy. I'm talking about 23-24, not 24-25, which is the forthcoming year. I'm going to come to that only. So you have already seen such huge cuts across the board in 2023-24, and you also see some more cuts in 23-24, which I missed mentioning. Take the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, big housing scheme of the government. There, in rural areas, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Rural, you saw a cut of rupees 22,000 crore between the budget estimate and the revised estimate of 2023-24. This is a huge. Pradhan Mantri Grama Sadak Yojana, you see a cut by rupees 2,000 crore. Come to this year, that is the difference between 23-24 and 24-25. You will see that your fertilizer subsidy, because I said this 88,000 crore has to be cut. That's the only way you will manage the balance the budget. So where is it likely to happen? Fertilizer subsidy is going to be cut by rupees 25,000 crore. Your food subsidy is going to be cut by rupees 7,000 crore. Then a range of other cuts. If you look at higher education, all the centrally sponsored schemes in higher education, if you see your expenditure on all centrally sponsored schemes in higher education was about 996 crore in 22-23. It rose to 1,320 crore in 23-24. It is going to further rise to 1,813 crore in 24-25. You will be very happy. This is a rise happening. But the catch is what is inside. All of this increase in expenditure is going to happen because of an increase in allocation for one set of institutions which are called world-class institutions. Only they are going to get all this money that is kept aside for centrally sponsored schemes in higher education. UGC. The budget for UGC has been cut this year means 24-25 by rupees 3,900 crore. It was 6,409 crore last year, 23-24. It is now, if you look at the budget papers, you see only rupees 2,500 crore instead of 6,409 crore for UGC. But you see some support increasing for the allocations in central universities. They are going to see some increase in allocation by about 3,000 crore, 3,472 crore, but there is absolutely no increase in allocations for IIMs, IITs, ISERs, Indian Institute of Science, Triple IT. No increase. There is no money for RUSA also kept aside, but what the government is saying is that they are going to replace RUSA by a new scheme called PM Usha. And they have kept aside some money for it. We don't know how exactly that's going to play out. Even a small scheme, I'll just give you two small schemes. Even that money has been cut this year, which is very sad. Prime Minister's Girls Hostel Scheme in higher education. There was a scheme. That money has been cut by rupees 8 crore. Scholarship for students in higher education with disabilities has been cut from rupees 155 crore, a very paltry amount to begin with. Even that has been cut from 155 crore to 142 crore. So you see a range of cuts like this across schemes in agriculture, in food, fertilizer subsidies, in higher education, in different nutrition schemes like PM Poshan. All these are seeing a cut across the board in this. Coming finally to the new announcement, which is essentially two in number. One is the government claiming that they are bringing in a new scheme for employment and skill development. It has announced that it is going to spend rupees 2 lakh crore over 5 years, which is about rupees 40,000 crore per year if you divide it by 5. And essentially, what all these schemes, if you look at it, you may have seen in newspapers about them. There are 5 schemes, all of which, if you employ somebody in the formal sector, sometimes if you, for example, the first scheme is for those who are newly employed with a monthly salary of less than rupees 1 lakh, that person will get rupees 15,000 per month in the first month of their employment. But that is the upper limit. 15,000 rupees is upper limit for one. In the second scheme, both the employer and the employee will share the benefit. And then there is some scheme, another scheme to invest in ITIs. And there are 5 such schemes that you generally have. And the total allocation is supposed to be rupees 2 lakh crore. But what is interesting is not all of this is by the central government. Already it has been announced that rupees 20,000 crore of this must be from the state governments, and another significant proportion, we don't know how much that is because the numbers are not clear yet, will come from the CSR funds of the industry. So even though the central government is saying rupees 2 lakh crore across 5 years, spread across 5 years, only a small proportion of it, or a proportion of it, is likely to come from the budget of the union government. The rest is likely to come from state governments, and another part is likely to come from the CSR funds of industry. So we don't know how it is going to play out. The additional burden on the government is likely to be very small. But more important, I see that these transfers which are made to the employers to begin with in some of these sub schemes are essentially transfers to the capitalist sector in big corp. Just like you allow them corporate tax cuts, you are allowing, are these people that these companies would not have employed if this money or scheme was not available? Hardly so. Additional employment would have happened anyway. But for that additional employment that would have happened anyway, what we call the taxpayers' money, to the coffers of private industry. Internship is one scheme. almost every student in TISS is going for internship. This scheme on internships is unlikely to lead to even one additional intern being taken into the government or the private sector, because internships are already a very happening thing in the industry and academia. But you have kept aside rupees 2,000 crore for an internship scheme in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs or the Ministry of Skill Development and so on. But these are not likely to make any difference in terms of the generation of new jobs, in terms of skilling a significant section of our society, or increasing investments in ITIs, or creating more internships, or preparing these interns for future jobs, etc. That is the key takeaway from the celebrated announcement related to employment that we have in the budget. The last point that I wanted to make is that a lot of claims of this government are happening around a huge expenditure that has happened in the budgets. For 2024-25, the government is saying that they will raise the capital expenditure further to 1111111, that is about 11.1 lakh crore rupees in 2024-25, which is the same number which was presented in the interim budget in February 2024 also. But the catch here, I mean, this is not an original point from me. A lot of people who observe public finance know it inside out. A lot of this expenditure that you see in capital expenditure is not necessarily capital expenditure. So if you have 11.1 lakh crore set aside as capital expenditure for 2024-25, 1.63 lakh crore out of it is loans and advances to state governments. Loans and advances given to state governments are kept as capital expenditure of the central government in their accounts. And these loans and advances that are given to the state governments may or may not be translated into capital expenditure at the state government level. A part of it can actually be a revenue expenditure also. So this is not necessarily capital expenditure to begin with. 1.63 lakh crore as loans and advances to state governments. Second is the capital outlay for defense, 1.72 lakh crore. That is also kept here as capital expenditure. But most of the defense equipment is imported. Only a part of it is produced here. When you import from outside the country, where that means production is not taking place in our country, even that gets counted as capital expenditure in our budget books. So that is also doubtful capital expenditure. Third is capital outlay on communication services, which is essentially equity infusion into companies like BSNL, MTNL, etc. That is also kept aside as capital expenditure. That comes to about 83,000 crore rupees. In the past, when Air India was sold, the government had actually given rupees 60,000 crore or close to that amount to the purchasing firm, the Tatas, in order to make it sellable, in order to absorb its debts and so on. That 60,000 crore that the government put into Air India, infused into Air India to make it sellable, was also put under capital expenditure in that year. So you will see that if you remove all these suspectful elements from the capital expenditure total of 11.1 lakh crore, all these suspectful elements that I just cited come to about 4.2 lakh crore rupees adding up, and deduct it from 11.1 lakh crore, you are likely to get only about rupees 7 lakh crore as capital expenditure. Subhash Chandra Garg, who was the finance secretary, who was participating in budget making with Arun Jaitley during the NDA-1 government, who appeared to have a little quarrel with Nirmala Sitharaman and resigned and came out. If you follow his articles, which are appearing in newspapers, he will tell you that between 2017-18 and now, the government claims that capital expenditure has risen by 25%. But if you actually remove all these suspectful elements and do one more thing, which is that the government, what the government has done is a lot of extra budgetary resources which were earlier generated outside the budget. For example, the Food Corporation of India borrows money from the market and the government stands guarantee to it. It does not come in the government's fiscal deficit, but comes as the debt of FCI as a company. But the Food 15th Finance Commission said this is no more possible. They said all EBRs, extra budgetary resources like this, should be shown as part of your fiscal deficit. So all these expenditures, which were loans taken by FCI, National Highway Authority of India, all these entities were actually brought into the budget 2 or 3 years back. Suddenly, all of them were, National Highway Authority builds roads, so it's all capital expenditure. That borrowed money of the NHAI comes as capital expenditure into the budget and shows up as a high rise of capital expenditure in the budget, whereas this capital expenditure is a capital expenditure that has already been happening outside the budget. So, if you take out the suspectful elements, if you take out the EBRs, the actual rise of capital expenditure between 2017-18 and 2023-24 is not 25% increase, but just about 5% increase according to Mr. Dar. You can read his article in Deccan Herald. So this essentially shows that the whole claim of additional capital expenditure in the economy is also deeply suspect. And that's not surprising, because if you have an overall budget which has to shrink by close to rupees 88,000 crore rupees, even though you cut your expenditure in agriculture, education, etc., scholarship, etc., you still are not able to manage the deficit. You will still be under deficit, and within the deficit, when you stand in the middle of the deficit, how will you find money for more capital expenditures? It's very unlikely. That is where all these tinkering with bookkeeping in budgets comes as a very easy tool for the government to sort of show that capital expenditure has actually significantly increased, where in reality it has been very marginally higher, only marginally higher than what was actually happening on the ground in the previous year. So that is also. So let me slowly close my main presentation. We can have questions and answers later. There was a context to this budget, as I started with, which was the election loss. Then you have the deep economic problems that are afflicting our society in terms of poor growth, destruction of production, destruction of employment, poor aggregate demand, the absence of government spending, the decline of net FDI flows, etc., etc. And so I sort of started with the premise that I expected the government to spend more on growth, production, jobs, to spend more on social protection, to spend more on expanding human capital. As the numbers show, between 22-23 and 23-24 also there was a fall of expenditure if you compare the budgetary expenditure and the revised expenditure, that is for last year. And if you look at 23-24 and 24-25 also, you see a major fall of expenditures in a range of sectors, and the budget itself is supposed to shrink by rupees 88,000 crore. The rest all the rest of claims that you see is actually either a play of words or just tinkering with budget books. The key point is this is a contractionary budget when your country required an expansionary budget. As a result, the challenges of growth, the challenges of unemployment, the challenge of rejuvenating production, the challenge of expanding social protection, the challenge of investing more in human capital, all of these challenges are likely to be very poorly addressed in the coming year as well. Thank you.
Professor, are you accepting questions?
Yes, just a second. Before we, first of all, thanks a lot, sir, for this enriching session. Like from setting the context to then unpacking with the budget and everything, I think we have got a very holistic understanding of what the budget is all about, and some of the so-called jumlas, as we call it, have also been deciphered here. I think it has been very enriching for all of us here. One thing which must be mentioned here is that meeting was running like full for the whole time, and many people weren't able to join and were texting us throughout how to join. So we had shared the Facebook link. So there also many students and interested people are listening to this lecture. As well as later it would also be uploaded on YouTube, so others can check out there. Before we go on to the question answer session, one thing also that needs to be mentioned is for the past 12 years, except for the pandemic years, this lecture has happened inside the campus and has again received a whole lot of participation from students, from faculty who have attended and enjoyed this lecture. But lately, we are also seeing some changes and in the administration and how they are responding to student-led events. Presently, there are no guidelines on how to conduct events, physically conduct these lectures inside campus, which is why we have shifted this to the online mode as a form to say that the lectures and the sort of character of TISS won't change. PSF will continue to hold such lectures in whatever form possible and reach out to the maximum people with it. I think yes, with that we can take some questions. Some are in the chat box also, and others can, I think, raise their hand. And then one by one we can call. We can take 3 questions, I think, sir. That would be good. And then you can answer them together. Okay, first, yes, VJ, we can take.
Hi, Professor. I think this is my 10th year, other than the pandemic years, joining in into your questions. Thank you to the PSF team and to you as well. Doing this remotely, I'm sure it's a sign of protest and well deserved, but also helps people like us who are not in Bombay to be able to dial in, right? Now that the advantage there is I also have a good memory. So I remember this is the first speech. In fact, I made a mental note when I was watching the finance minister make this speech that I have to tell Professor Ramakumar that she didn't once use the word disinvestment in her speech this year, right? So that is, do you think you owe her some credit that she's actually met her disinvestment target last year and now has stopped talking about disinvestment at all? That's the first broad theme that I wanted to do. The second one is the RBI transfers. I'm somehow not able to understand what exactly is going on, right? I don't think it's received necessary sort of scholarly review inputs as well. Is it RBI pusillanimity or what is going on? Are they just, roughing them up and asking for more money? That's something I've had difficulty understanding as well, right? And finally, center-state relations. I know I've seen a lot of your recent work. You've done a piece for the Morning Context a long time back, which is essentially complaining that the center does not let the states borrow for capital expenditure. So I thought you should be happy that at least in one case, which is Andhra Pradesh, all 15,000 is going to be necessarily sort of capital expenditure. Also in one place where you're personally, I'm sure, your inputs matter, right? For a state like Kerala, where the CE, I think perhaps is the largest in the country, where I don't think they have any money left. I might be wrong, you'll have to correct me, you'll have the facts better, but the committed expenditure for Kerala is the largest in the country, right? So will they be in a position to make a new capital expenditure at all? So in that case, isn't it better to reward a state like Andhra Pradesh and then punish a state like Kerala? So these are my 3 broad themes. Once again, thank you so much. This is always a pleasure to join. And to all those who are hearing, and I'm sure this is going to go as a recording, this is a space where I've never really agreed with many things that Professor Ramakumar has taught me. But let this, at least who the powers might be, realize that if this much civil discourse can't happen on the campus, I don't know what else. What's the point of having a campus, right? So with that, over to you, sir.
So there are 3 questions already. So would you like to go, or should we take some more from chat?
Let me just take this very quickly.
Okay.
Thank you, VJ. I don't know your name, but I am sure I saw you very regularly in the campus and during my offline lectures. And I'm happy to hear that you remember, let's say, those old good days that you're referring to. Let's hope that they'll come back soon. But the point here, the points that you made is that why disinvestment has probably gone out of favor is primarily because it is unlikely that if you put a firm for disinvestment today, it is unlikely that you will get a remunerative price for it. That is, I think there is not enough demand in the economy or among the investors to make such huge purchases of PSUs, primarily loss-making PSUs at this point of time. And that's, I think, one important. I don't government is not committed to disinvestment. I think this government is simply unable to sell. And one of the disastrous decisions that it took about a few years back was to disinvest from the LIC, which is like the hen that lays the golden goose for the government every year. It sort of rescues the government from all sorts of crises. It sort of allows investment to be made in different sectors where others don't come in, and so on. And that's the sector which the government wanted to disinvest a few years back. But even that had to be shelved because there was no demand for that kind of disinvestment in the economy. So that's I don't think that there's an ideological opposition to disinvestment. I think simply because the conditions in the economy do not allow for disinvestment to proceed the way they want to go. Number two, what is happening in the RBI? I'm not going to speculate on why they decided on such a large transfer in an election year, but the point is that RBI has been making huge profits over the years, and they have kept it as reserves for a long period of time. This is the time that they have transferred it, and whatever money they have earned this time is due to the arbitrages that they earn by keeping foreign exchange, selling foreign exchange, etc. That's the part which has really expanded their kitties, and that's from where the RBI has decided to pass on a dividend to the government. So it might be a temporary thing in my view. The government hopes that it will continue next year, but I don't think it will continue in the next year if that is what the expectation of the government is. I don't think that is likely to continue next year. So RBI is saying it received a bonanza during the election year, but I don't think it will continue in the next year. I'll just stick to that. I'm not unhappy with whatever has been given for Andhra Pradesh or any other state. I think whatever all these states require, Andhra Pradesh Reorganization Act, when it was enacted, the state was promised a certain transfer from the government. And I'm happy that of late it is indeed happening. And what is unfortunate is that it had to come to a certain kind of a political compulsion on the part of the central government to fulfill a promise that was made long back. So I'm not unhappy at any transfer made to Andhra Pradesh, and that's not. I never really sort of put that as a criticism in my talk. My point is that my larger point here is that any transfer outside the Finance Commission recommendations to state governments must be in some form rule-based. It cannot be discretionary, or it should not be discretionary. Discretionary grants made by the central government to states, which includes the transfers under different centrally sponsored schemes, is where there is a lot of displeasure on the part of state governments, lot of doubts on the part of state governments as to whether they are subject to political discrimination, etc., or not. And that is where the real trouble is. My larger point is that such discretionary grants should come down and more of rule-based transfers must happen. And that is why I'm a votary for an increase of the devolution from the net proceeds from the current 41% to the state governments to 50% in the period of the 16th Finance Commission. What they decide is up to them, but that's what I think should be done. Lastly, coming to the situation of Kerala. Kerala's situation is more complicated. I don't think I can explain it in a very brief amount of time. But what is clear is that it has suffered on the hands of a central government, which appears to be hell-bent on financially strangling it in some form. For example, it had borrowings outside the state budget, which were called, I referred to a little while back as extra budgetary resources in this talk. So it has a body corporate which does that. And it used to do that with the central government in the past, and the central government continued to allow it later also. But from one fine morning, the problem was that the central government said, you cannot do that anymore. And it also said that this restriction will apply retrospectively. By retrospectively, what we mean is that what you have borrowed over the last 3 or 4 years will also now be suddenly or abruptly cut from this year's borrowing limit of yours. That's what made the situation very difficult for the government of Kerala. Now the case has gone to the Supreme Court. They will now rule on it in the appropriate form. But the problem needs a larger discussion, and it essentially falls under the ambit of
think there is some internet issue on Ramkumar's end. So,
I'm sorry, I joined from another device. I think there was some problem. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir. Now
Yes, Professor.
Yeah.
I got your response, Professor. Thank you. I mean, I don't know about the retrospective one, so I got it. Thank you.
in the timing.
Are you able to hear me and see me?
Yes, we can hear and see. Okay, I think we can take some questions which have come in the comment box also. Supriya is asking, as Professor mentioned, that women's work in agricultural sector is the only sector that has shown growth. How should we look at the aspect of gender budgeting, especially in the care economy?
Now, this, should I answer it immediately or I'll wait?
What is ideal, sir? I think, can you take 3 questions and you can answer?
How many questions are you planning to give me till the end of the lecture? I mean, just to get an idea, then I'll plan accordingly.
I think 5-6 more we can take.
5-6 more. Then I'll take maybe 2 or 3 at a time, and then take it together.
Then there is a question by Chandan Dava who is saying, is legalizing MSP enforceable? What are the challenges related to this, and what can be the effects of providing legal guarantee on the union budget and the Indian economy? Justy Alex is asking, ideally, how the income tax slab of the country should look like in the context of our economy. What could be the ways to unburden the middle class from this cutthroat tax collection? These 3 I think we can take now.
Sure, let's take this. So the first question about gender. Now, I mentioned a large number of schemes where expenditures were cut last year and they are going to be cut this year also. So let me try to give you 1 or 2 small examples from the budget allocations to the Ministry of Women and Child Development. Now, there is one umbrella scheme there, which is called the Mission for Protection and Empowerment of Women, which basically came into being with the Nirbhaya incident in early 2010s. So if you look at the mission, the actual allocation in 22-23, or actual spending in 2022-23 was rupees 500 crore. Okay, but when it came to 2023-24, this 500 crore came down to 30 crore. And in 2024-25, it is going to stay at rupees 30 crore. Right? What does this include? This includes different schemes that this schemes funded from the Nirbhaya fund, transferred to the Nirbhaya fund, and so on. That is going to see a huge fall. Okay. Now, if you take another scheme there, for example, there is a new scheme which is coming called the Mission Shakti, Mission for Protection and Empowerment of Women. That is likely to, some people may say, look, we are having this Mission Shakti and that's going to replace the other one and so on. There, if you see, the budgeted expenditure for 2023-24 was rupees 3,143 crore. But how much was spent? Only about 2,325 crore. A fall by about 800 crore rupees in this last year itself. Okay? And within that, there's a lot of, the finance minister likes to mention this scheme all the time, Mission Vatsalya, Child Protection Services and Child Welfare Services. Right? That again had an allocation of 1,500 crore rupees last year, but what was spent was only about 1,200 crore rupees. So, if you look at the Ministry of Child and Development, what you see is exactly the same picture as you saw in the case of SC/ST development, you saw in the case of higher education, scholarships, etc. The expenditure cuts have been continuing last year, and they are likely to continue in the coming year, which is 24-25 also. That is and as all these are part of the gender budget that we spoke, right? The gender budget has a wider ambit of coverage. It includes schemes from across departments. But I am just taking as an example the case of the Ministry of Women and Child Development, which is a central ministry which deals with women-centered schemes and programs. That has seen a huge budget cut last year, and it is likely to see a similar budget cut in 2024-25. That is the ongoing year also. Second question was about the legality of the MSP. It is possible. It is possible. No, it is. See, the MSP becoming legal need not become a huge fiscal burden on the part of the central government, because the government need not procure all food grains under the MSP system if the market prices in certain years are above the MSP. Then farmers will not be ready to sell at MSP to the government, but they will sell to the market, right? And so the government need not purchase everything to begin with if the market prices are above the MSP in certain years. Number one. Number two, in the other years, the remaining years, if the market prices are lower than the MSP, so MSP is higher than the market price, and the government comes in and says, I'll buy, and then the government starts buying at the MSP, it need not buy all the product in this country. If it purchases just about 10% or 20% of the produce at that MSP, the market prices will start rising. And market prices will start rising so rapidly that it will either be equivalent to the MSP or even rise above the MSP, at which point the government can stop procuring under that MSP. So the assumption in all these sort of scary pictures drawn in the media and the pink press is that you have to spend 5 lakh crore rupees, 10 lakh crore rupees, etc. All those are assumptions, all those are projections based on the assumption that the government is going to buy all the produce that is produced in the country at the MSP. But that need not be the case, as I just tried to illustrate to you. In my view, the additional expenditure that would be required will be minuscule, rupees 1 lakh crore or rupees 2 lakh crore, if you take the assumptions that I mentioned to be the realities in those years. Either when the MSP when the market price is above the MSP, the government need not procure at all. When the market price is below the MSP, the government only needs to procure to the extent that market prices start rising and reach the level equal to the MSP or rise above it. Right? So there is no real problem that is likely to come if you actually make MSP legal. Coming to income tax. Now the real problem in this country's fiscal system today is that the share of our gross tax revenue coming from direct taxes has now surpassed the share of revenue coming from corporate taxes. The share of corporate taxes in the total revenue is plummeting, particularly after the corporate tax cuts that you've had. As a result, direct taxes are growing, corporate taxes are falling as a share of the total. This is the broad context in which you have to see the so-called squeeze of the middle class that we are talking about. Now, in my personal view, long-term capital gains tax is no different from income. If you are having long-term capital gain tax at the slabs that you currently have, the highest one being 30%. Now, that is just from income, and that is exactly the principle followed in most capitalist countries of the world. Why can't we follow it here? So I'm not going to think or worry too much about long-term capital gains taxes growing by a little bit or indexation going and so on. The key point here in this country is that the government is forced to squeeze the middle class or the income earning class or the salary earning class, primarily because it doesn't see any other source of income, particularly when the corporate tax as a share of the total tax income is falling, and that too because it cut the corporate tax rate from 30% to 22%. That is the context in which we will have to see this. If the corporate taxes were remaining high at 30%, the government may not have had to squeeze the middle class in the way it is doing it now, number one. And number two, as I said, as a matter of principle, I don't think long-term capital gains are different from income, and they must be charged just like income is taxed.
Thank you, sir. I think now we can take a final set of questions. If someone wants to raise their hand and ask directly, that also is fine. Otherwise, some from the chat are. Hardik has asked, given the reduction in budget allocation, how will higher education institutions manage their finances development? What are the potential potential consequences of India's global standing in education. Then Anjali R is asking, sir, where is the unspent surplus being defined in the economy? How is it justified and where is it used? If anyone wants to
I don't know what she meant by unspent surplus. If she could kindly clarify in the chat box, that would be helpful. What she means by the term, I'll wait for that clarification. But let's go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. Some other questions are, which is again related to this farm economy. Parvez Alam is asking, now more women are entering into agriculture. As we know that as economy grows, workers gradually shift from farm toward non-farm sector. But in India, this is contradictory. Why is this the case in India?
Yeah, let's take these now. But I'm happy to take a couple of questions more if there is time and if there are questions remaining. Higher education institutions. It's a real crisis. Now, let's take one indicator, which is the gross enrollment ratio. Gross enrollment ratio in tertiary education is that ratio which tells us, if you take as denominator the population of people who are aged between 18 and 23, that's the population as the denominator, how many of them are in colleges, are enrolled in colleges? That is the gross enrollment ratio. What is the gross enrollment ratio in advanced capitalist countries? Say, United States, Netherlands, Germany, etc. It's close to 75%, 85%, and in some countries going up to 90%. 90% of those between the ages of 18 and 23 are enrolled in some form of tertiary education. That is the situation across the world. The fastest rise of gross enrollment ratio that you saw in the last 20 to 30 years was in China. China had a gross enrollment ratio somewhere less than 30%, 20 or 25 years back. Today they have a gross enrollment ratio of close to 60%, tripling the gross enrollment ratio in about 2 decades. That's a Chinese miracle in higher education. That's because they spent that money. I visited a few Chinese universities and I've been startled and astonished as to how these institutions were built over a short period of time and what kind of investment and expenditure must have gone into these institutions. Come to India. The gross enrollment ratio in India is a pathetic 27%. 27%, only 27% of those between 18 and 23 years of age are in some kind of tertiary education enrollment. And there are states which are much higher in these ratios. Kerala, for example, stands at 43%, which is very high. But there are states like what we call as the Bimaru states and so on, where the ratio is very, very far lower than 27% and even 18%, 19% and so on. So this is the challenge that we have. The challenge is to raise the gross enrollment ratio from 27%. The Niti Aayog had a report which said it wants to take it to 50% by 2030. And and if you consider that as your goal, I must say that we are not going to achieve that 50% goal even in a year like 2050. That's the way we are progressing every year in terms of gross enrollment ratio. We have to invest heavily in higher education, which is a corollary of investments that we make in school education. So we make investments in school education. When they pass out of class 11 and 12, they are absorbed into the tertiary education system increasingly in larger numbers, and that needs public investment. But unfortunately in India, we have left that task to the private sector. We have left that task to Ashoka. We have left that task to Jindal. We have left that task to Lovely. We have left that task to all kinds of characters which are in the profit domain. They call themselves as non-profit, but essentially you have very high levels of fees. You have very high levels of cost of living in those institutions, and the quality of education is not necessarily superior to what you get in an average public college in Delhi University. This is the situation that we have. Take Delhi University, which many of you may be familiar with. Look at the number of teachers in Delhi University who are on hourly teaching contracts. It's a pathetic situation. One unfortunate faculty member recently in Delhi University committed suicide because after serving for about 20 years on an ad hoc basis, he was denied a post when the permanent position opened up. We are seeing currently in Tata Institute of Social Sciences what is happening, which is a story which you all are familiar with. Now, this is the absence of public investment in higher education, which is a very serious issue at an overall level. Within that, there are sub-issues, for example, in terms of scholarships to students, in terms of hostels for students, etc., where also there must be public investment coming in, but very little is coming. As I said, the whole budget of the UGC itself has been extraordinarily cut in 24-25. So, where is the support for research programs? Where is the support for creating a knowledge economy in this country? If you take science and technology, if you take research and development, if you take the number of patents that we register in India, we are on a pathetically low level compared to a fast-growing country or economy like China, or already growing economies like South Korea and so on. We are far back in the rank in terms of the number of patents that we have and so on. All these are indications that we are not investing in science and technology, we are not investing in research and development. In fact, Tata Institute of Social Sciences is largely a humanities-based institution, which is considered sometimes as not generating enough profits and so on, and hence are not considered deserving of funds. But even in those sectors in science, which meets this, which fulfills this requirement, the investments are falling. That is the sad state of higher education that we see in this country, and unless that changes significantly, I don't see this country moving into a status where we are able to reap the benefits of modern science and technology applied to for the betterment or well-being of the people, and also, on the other hand, raising employability of its young population and so on. We are very close to missing the bus with respect to our demographic dividend. That's the key point that comes from. The point last made about women in agriculture, I see that as a perverse trend. A lot of economists have called it a structural retrogression in the economy. Others have called it premature industrialization in the economy. Yet others have called it a reverse structural change in the economy. What you are seeing is people crowding. How much of the GDP comes from agriculture? Less than 20%. Let's say 20%. So out of 100 rupees generated in the economy, only 20 rupees comes from agriculture. But out of 100 people in the economy, close to 46 people are employed in agriculture. So 46 people live on 20 rupees, whereas 54 people live on 80 rupees. That is the situation that we have. So just imagine the per capita incomes. 46 people live on 20 rupees and 54 people live on 80 rupees. So this is the situation that we have, and we have been trying to pull people out of agriculture into industry, services, etc. But that task has been stymied by demonetization, GST reform, then our poor response to or inability to protect our enterprises during COVID. Our informal sector has been collapsing. And all those people who are losing employment in urban and semi-urban areas in industry and services are now crowding agriculture for employment. And agriculture is already crowded. So your per capita incomes are likely to further fall as a result of this crowding. And you already see an indication of this in the form of falling real wages for all occupations in rural areas, according to the government's own official data. So it is a sad state. It it is something that must be that should have been avoided, and that's certainly something that is a blot on the Indian economy in the last 8 or 10 years.
Thanks a lot, sir. I think now that we are nearing the 2-hour mark, we can move towards the end of the lecture. And thanks a lot everyone for joining. For a formal vote of thanks, I would like to invite EB member Aruna to give the vote of thanks.
Hi all, I am Arina and I am a second year student of MA Social Work in TISS Mumbai and also an executive body member of PSF TISS. First of all, on behalf of PSF TISS, I would like to thank Professor Ramakumar sir for this insightful session. I feel very happy to share that we were running on the maximum capacity of the platform for the majority of the time. So it's to a very great extent because of the manner in which you share every details, how you handle the session. So thank you sir for that. Unfortunately, many couldn't join the session and we have provided the Facebook live link as well as Lagan have already mentioned. So thank you sir for that. Next, I would like to thank all the current students of the upcoming batch of 2024 our freshers and also our alumni who have joined us here today. Also, I would like to thank all those who are outside batches who are here with us today in this lecture. Thank you all for your participation and cooperation throughout the session. Also, we will be continuing organizing such insightful sessions in future as well. So, if you are interested in becoming a part of it, do join us. A Google form has already been shared in the chat box. Kindly fill in the form if you feel like. Once again, on behalf of this PSF TISS, I would like to thank all those who have joined here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you organizers for inviting me and organizing this in a very successful form. Let's hope that this platform continues to thrive and continues into the future years as well. Thank you.